Today I'm speaking with Maia Szalavitz. Maia's the author of the New York Times bestseller Unbroken Brain, a revolutionary new way of understanding addiction, which is widely regarded as an important advance in thinking about the nature of addiction and how to cope with it, personally and politically. Her book, Help at Any Cost: How the Troubled Teen Industry Cons Parents and Hurts Kids, was the first to expose the damage caused by the quote, tough love business that dominates adolescent addiction treatment. She's written for numerous publications from the High Times to the New York Times, including Time, the Washington Post, The Guardian, Vice, Scientific American, and The Atlantic. And she is the author or co author of 5 other books. With Dr. Bruce Perry, she co wrote the classic work on child trauma, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, and also Born for Love: Why Empathy is Essential and Endangered. She's won awards from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the Drug Policy Alliance, the American Psychological Association, and the American College of Neuropsychopharmacology for her 30 years of groundbreaking writing on addiction, drug policy, and neuroscience. Maia, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, the first question I wanted to ask you was just around your own story and how you got interested in working and writing in the field of addiction.
Sure. So basically, I had always been torn between do I want to be like a scientist or a writer? So, science writers kind of in the middle. And what I realized very quickly was that writing about addiction is often horrible. There's lots of myths and there's lots of misinformation and there's lots of really propaganda. So I also wanted to find out like what the heck had happened and how I had gone from being sort of a gifted student to being like, shooting heroin. So it was basically a combination of all of those things.
Yeah, yeah. So you mentioned, struggling with addiction yourself. What changed for you? Was there a turning point, and what were some of the approaches that were helpful for you, whether it was through a treatment center or something you discovered on your own?
Right. I definitely was not a good candidate for any of the tough confrontational stuff. And I was really terrified of that. And that made me avoid treatment for a while. I was briefly on methadone, which I now realize I was on way too low a dose. And the way the program was structured was not particularly helpful. So although we now know that methadone and buprenorphine cut the overdose death rate by 50% or more from opioid addiction, which is especially important in an environment filled with fentanyl. At that time, I just was told that, oh, you're just substituting one addiction for another. And, it's not really recovery and all this stuff that I now know is nonsense. But anyway, I was on that for about 6 months. And then I did a sort of traditional 28-day, 12-step abstinence program, which was helpful for me at the time. I was basically desperate at that point, and had realized that something had to change. I mean, I was just so skinny. I looked older than I look now, and I was just so depressed and upset, and not to mention facing a 15 to life sentence because of drug dealing. So a lot of stuff was going on. I don't like to frame it, however, as it was hitting bottom, because I feel that that is only a retrospective narrative device. It's not a scientific or predictable thing. And when we have policies that are designed to force people into so-called hitting bottom by like arresting them and humiliating them and shaming them and doing all this kind of stuff, we know that that does harm. So, but I certainly did have a turning point where I realized, like, wow, I need help. And I had a court date the next day. I went there and I had I my dad was with me and he took me up to my mom's house and then we got into the rehab. I now have some disagreements with this notion that the 12 steps are the only way to recover. I don't believe that. But since that was what I was told, and that's what the medical people were telling me was the absolute truth, I was like, okay, well, this seems really weird to me, but I shall try.
Hmm. I really appreciate your vulnerability and being willing to share your own story, which I'm sure many people out there will connect to. And, you talk about sort of the normal or traditional approach to drug treatment, which involves a lot of shame for people.
Yeah,
And it tends to be, a pretty punitive approach, especially when we're talking about how drugs are criminalized and what ends up happening to people who are struggling with addiction. But I'm wondering if you could help tease out for us kind of what the, normal or traditional approaches are to drug treatment, and then we'll kind of get into some of the harm reduction stuff and some of the
sure.
approaches that you sort of advocate for.
Sure. So, basically, traditionally in American treatment, there's been three modalities: methadone, which had its own very isolated, literally ghettoized system of clinics. Um, the thing called therapeutic communities, which was based on the cult called Synanon, which involves humiliating, confronting, and trying to break people's personalities down in a very intense residential living setting that unfortunately often turns into cults. But that any 18-month addiction treatment or longer in the US tends to be based on this idea that, like, we'll confront you, we'll humiliate you, we'll break your personality down, and then we'll rebuild you into a nice, sober citizen. So that was the second modality. And then the third one is the traditional 12-step Minnesota model, which is basically teaching you about the 12 steps, teaching you that you're powerless and that you need to find higher power and you need to confess and pray and make amends. So it's a very, very moral model at the same time as they're telling you, well, this is a disease, and yet treating it unlike any other disease. Because if you told me to, like, pray and confess for my depression, you know, I would not. I would not accept that as treatment for depression. I don't think it's appropriate. And what I do think is the case that since 12-step programs and the community and the support and the connection and the love that really are offered to many people there, I think that's fabulous. It just needs to be divorced from addiction treatment. For one, you can get that for free in pretty much most church basements. So why should we pay for you to be indoctrinated into that when we're paying $1,000 or more a day for you in a so-called hospital 28-day setting? That to me makes no sense. I think that in that setting, what you should get is cognitive behavioral or motivational enhancement or some of these other therapies that are evidence-based that don't have issues around morality or higher powers or spirituality or any of that. And then they can say, look, social support is super critical to recovery. A lot of people find it in 12-step groups. You might want to try it. You should try a few groups because they're very different from each other. But if that's not your cup of tea, we got other stuff.
Mhm. Yeah, the issue of morality is really tricky for people. And you mentioned this sort of paradox between, framing it as kind of a moral failing, but then also the solution would be sort of giving it up and giving up to a higher power, which can be really helpful for people, but can also kind of take away their sense of agency or that internal locus of control that people have. Um, but the sense of moral failing can create that shame and can sort of strengthen one's identity of being an addict. Um, which can be really difficult. And as you know, this can sort of reinforce the cycle of addiction. These are the reasons why we're using substances in the first place to try to, take away those negative emotions. And, I'm a clinical psychologist, and I know in working with my patients, that, shame and blame and punishment as natural strategies as those are, they just don't work. And alternatively, accepting people and these compassion approaches. And you mentioned, kind of motivational enhancement, which is a very non-confrontational approach, has a lot of great evidence behind it. Can you explain for our listeners a little bit about sort of either motivational enhancement or just kind of the non-confrontational approaches about accepting people and meeting people where they're at in their own journey?
Yes, yes. Well, the thing about addiction is that it involves these cycles of shame and self-hatred and self-blame, um, that are kind of only relieved by the substance. And then of course that makes it worse because then you blame yourself for that. And it's like all of these double binds and bad cycles and all kinds of very unfortunate experiences. So what motivational enhancement does is it basically says, okay, let's talk about what your goals are. What do you want to do? What would you like if you could have the ideal life? What would it be, and how can you get there? And are drugs in the way? If drugs aren't in the way, then we're not going to focus on that. We're going to focus on like what is in the way. If you start to find out over the course of therapy that it actually drugs are in the way, then you can work on that. But it's not focused on you must be abstinent and you must be abstinent from everything. It's just focused on how do we get you to a healthier and more productive and happier life. And I think a lot of the problem with the punitive approach is that like you're telling people you got to give up drugs, you got to give up sex, you got to give up this, you got to give up that. It's all about negatives. It's all about you got to stop this, we got to take this away. It's not about what is in it for me. Why should I go through this horribly painful withdrawal process and this horribly painful sense of the only thing that makes me comfortable and safe is being taken away, unless there's another thing, a better thing on the other end. And so what harm reduction and motivational enhancement and all of these other more compassionate approaches stress is that what is better for you is what we want for you. Mm-hmm. Not we need to control you and we need to take this stuff away from you and this is illegal and bad and wrong. It's like, okay, what would make your life more productive and happy? Or how can you improve your relationships? Like people want often pretty much the same thing. They want strong social relationships. They want their family. They want to be able to support themselves in a meaningful way. So how do we get people towards that? And how do we get people to have a sense of joy in life? And if you can do those things, you can help people recover. And that's like, this is why addiction treatment is so difficult because individuals vary tremendously. And though on those dimensions, we are all pretty similar, it's like, you might find collecting cars as your passion, and I might like to do swing dancing or something, but it's like if you force one of those on somebody else, like it's not going to work. It's like, I might like lifting weights, you might like running, but whatever works for you is not necessarily what's going to work for someone else. It's pretty clear that like physical exercise is super good for recovery, but it's really hard to get yourself to do it. And you have to I always think of it as being like the opposite of drugs. So you get the punishment first and then you get the pain rather than the reverse. And if you can realize that, then you can get yourself to go to the gym, do your thing. And then you're like, yeah, this is cool. It's just that bit in the, getting yourself there and actually doing it that can be, challenging, obviously. But so all of these approaches treat people as human beings who have normal motivations and desires and who we want the best for and who want the best for themselves. And, there's some sociopaths out there, yes, but for the vast majority of people, if you help them love themselves and help them better themselves and care, one of the things about addiction that's so terrible is that everybody thinks you're so awful. They're like crossing the street to avoid you. If somebody comes up to you and says, hey, I want you to be happier and better, and I'm not going to try to control you. I don't want to take away your drugs. I don't want to do anything. I just here's a clean needle because we don't want you shooting with dirty needles because you could get AIDS. And so when you approach somebody with that compassionate, non-judgmental stance of I'm a human being, you're a human being, we care, we want you to be okay, people who don't care about themselves that much because they are so oppressed or hurting or whatever, when they are approached with that compassionate stance, then a lot of amazing things can happen. We just get so focused on the drug and so focused on this idea that that's the problem. Well, to people with addiction, the drugs are the solution.
Mm.
Like, you're taking away their solution. So, like, how are you going to help?
Yeah. I love the way that you're framing that. And, you're talking about just it can be as simple as just like showing up and being compassionate to someone and loving someone, even before we get to all the technicalities about what are we going to do? We're going to CBT this, or we're going to replace it with methadone, et cetera. But first and foremost, people need to feel like they're seen, they're accepted for who they are. And you mentioned also like validating why they're using in the first place, which is to deal with pain.
Yeah.
So we know that that works, that that's what people need on an individual level. And I'm so interested in how this kind of scales and translates on a societal level. In our current system, we've really favored that punitive approach. But what would this look like on a societal level? And maybe that might help us segue a little bit into kind of the harm reduction approach.
Sure. So, I mean, so basically, right, this segues perfectly into harm reduction, because our current drug policy is focused on, we're going to arrest people, we want to reduce the number of drugs, we want to, like, a drug-free world or this kind of thing. Harm reduction is like, how can we reduce the greatest harm to the greatest number of people? And people are always going to use drugs. They always have. Cats use catnip. Like, it's like it predates us evolutionarily. Like, it's in every human society. The idea that, like, some intoxicants are okay, but others are bad, like racism and whatever you want to call it, like bias against others, is baked into our drug laws and the way we see what is a drug and what isn't. So what harm reduction says is, I don't care if you get high. I care if you get hurt or if you hurt somebody else. And so the idea then becomes, is what policy can we create that will reduce harm? So we can use clean needles, we can teach safe injection, we can have places where people can be safe, we can provide safer supplies, we can do all of this. And then everybody gets all freaked out because, like, oh no, you're enabling people and you're gonna, like, make it so that they never get better and this and that. In reality, when you treat people respectfully, they begin to be able to treat themselves more respectfully. And if you provide other alternatives, people are much, like, for example, if you actually provide free heroin in a pharmaceutical dose and setting, people are just as likely, if not more likely, to become abstinent than if they're constantly chasing that thing out in the streets. Because what happens is, when you actually provide a safe supply to people, their lives suddenly get really boring. Because, like, now that thing that you're spending all your time chasing, you got it and you got the dose you want and it's there. What are you going to do with the rest of that time? Maybe I can hang out with my family. Maybe I can get a job. Like, so it's really, it's all very counterintuitive when you've been sort of raised in the drug war. But if you just think about the way we handle other problems, we generally recognize that, like, people want to feel good and be okay. And if we can facilitate that rather than disable them, we can get people to to live better and have healthier lives. It's just like, we get so caught up in the drugs are bad, this is immoral, that we forget that killing people to save them is not really the best kind of policy.
Yeah, yeah. There's such a fear there, that this harm reduction approach would actually enable people, but we really have to ask ourselves, like, how well is our current approach working? How well have we been able to actually treat addiction in our society, and all the
Also, do
evidence?
we want to disable people? Like, the opposite of enabling people is disabling them. No.
Right.
I mean, people have disabilities, and that's cool, and we should not be ableist. but we should also not deliberately try to make people's lives harder. What's especially important about this is that addiction is defined as compulsive behavior that continues despite negative consequences. So adding more negative consequences is by definition not the way to fix it. And yet
Mhm.
that's exactly what we do. So what we need to do is provide ways to attract people into healthier and more happy lifestyles. The problem with that, of course, is that brings up we need housing, we need food, we need childcare, we need a lot of things to make this very unequal society more equal and to make people have meaningful alternatives to getting high all day.
Mhm.
So, so that rapidly becomes political, but that's just the way it is. And that's why addiction is often such a political football.
Yeah. There are other countries who have really taken up this harm reduction approach. I think Portugal and Switzerland are kind of prime examples of that. And, I want to kind of circle back to maybe what they're doing, but on the political end of things, these programs are very popular in those countries. And I believe because they're really making their communities better. And so we should be looking at the data and actually using that as a selling point to people who might be opposed and say, hey, actually, this is reducing, the amount of drug use or people using illegally on the streets. It's people in the community are feeling safer. There's a reduction in crime. I mean, all of this can actually be leveraged around, you know,
Right. I
changing
mean, because
policy.
people, the thing is that like it's hard in our much more unequal society to realize the true benefits of harm reduction. Because, for example, let's say you are providing a safe injection facility, which is great, and all those people who are using that facility are not shooting up on the street at that time. They might be shooting up on the street later when that place is closed because they still don't have a place to live.
Mhm.
So it is complicated, and this is why it's very hard to get people to see like, oh well, if you put up a safe injection site, the kids are going to, I mean, if you look at the people who are going into a safe injection facility, it's not like they're rock stars. It's not like it's glamorizing it for children. In fact, like what's more horrifying for children is to see people lying on the street and everybody just ignoring them.
Yeah.
So the both Portugal and Switzerland have made important contributions to understanding that, yes, if you treat people respectfully, if you treat drug use like a health problem, if you provide places that are welcoming, you can reduce street crime, you can reduce public injecting, you can definitely reduce the spread of HIV and other bloodborne illnesses, you can make people healthier, you can make them more productive, and have them be more there for their families. So it's like it's win all around. But part of the problem is that when you look at, like, say, an abstinence rehab, everybody there is abstinent and they look like they're healthy again, and they're doing they're when you look at a harm reduction program, people look just like they are still using because they are, and the ones that totally don't stand out are just not visible because they totally don't stand out. So in the abstinence place, you don't see the 60%, 80% of people that dropped out and who are back in that state, but you do see those people at the harm reduction place.
Mhm.
And so the way it looks on the surface can be very deceiving because in the harm reduction place, the people who are doing super well are not all that visible. And in the abstinence place, the people who are not doing well are not visible. And so it presents a public image issue that is very hard to get people to understand.
Mhm. So I want to ask you one more question, and I have two in mind, but I'm leaning towards one. So one of the questions I had in mind, you're framing addiction as a learning disorder or a developmental issue, and I find that fascinating and would love to pick your brain on that. Um, if we don't have time for that, I'm going to really encourage our listeners to pick up your new book, which is going to explore that in more detail. But while I have you here, there's another question, and I really want to take advantage of having your brain on this, because I think you'd provide an interesting perspective. But you wrote a article called or referring to pandemic shaming and how this might backfire. Um, can you tell us what you mean by pandemic shaming and how could this potentially backfire?
Right. Well, I mean, we're in a very weird transitional phase right now, but um, in the past, like you really had this impulse to like yell at people who weren't wearing masks or to be like, just to use public rejection to get people to change their behavior. And that can work fine if the behavior is something that's readily changeable. But say we created such a political situation where like wearing or not wearing a mask is kind of now a sign of identity rather than, hey, I'm just trying to protect myself from a respiratory disease. So, but shame, obviously, like people try to do things to avoid shame. But at the same time, if the activity is one that you cannot avoid, like social connection, um, shame is not going to stop people from seeking social connection in ways that may be dangerous during a pandemic. So instead, you need to work on reducing harm. So, like, yes, wear a mask if you're going to be indoors with people. Stay six, all of these stuff is like harm reduction because we're not going to say, okay, just go and live in a cage by yourself and don't interact with any other humans. Like, that is not realistic, just like it was unrealistic during AIDS to say, oh, just don't have sex. Because again, like all the shaming and all that kind of stuff is not going to stop the primary drive of life. So it is, yeah. But yeah, so this is why you might shame people into like wearing a seatbelt or something. But if you for other forms of harm reduction, you really need to work more on carrots rather than sticks.
Absolutely. Yeah. And unfortunately, the shaming and punitive approaches, not only are they not very effective, but they can actually be counterproductive and they can produce more of the behavior that we're trying to
Yeah.
suppress or change in people. So definitely clear parallels there between wearing a mask and then also how we would approach people with addiction and trying to change their behavior. So
Yeah.
this is something I'm so curious about, across multiple aspects of society, is how can we change our language, our communication, or even our policy to take a more compassionate approach to people and what they're struggling with. That seems, based on the science, that seems to be a more productive strategy than the shaming, blaming,
Yeah.
canceling, criticizing, and sort of
Right.
approach.
I mean, we have that evolutionary thing in us to do that. And it's very hard to see when that is a very bad tool and not use it because it seems like it should work. And it's, it is difficult, but when people's emotional survival is at stake, shaming them is not going to change their behavior. So you have to find ways for them to get that in less harmful ways. And that's really what harm reduction is about. It's about, finding ways to help people survive better and find their way, in this world.
Absolutely. Maia, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. You have a new book. It's called Undoing Drugs. Where can people find you or find your work, and how can they learn more about your writing?
Sure. So you could go to maiasz.com, MAIAS like Sam, Z like zebra.com. I won't spell the rest of my last name because nobody else can either. And so, but that is my website, and that will have information on where you can get the book and my other books and articles and stuff like that.
Fantastic. Awesome. Well, thank you so much again. And thank you for all the amazing work that you've been doing for us.
Thank you.